Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The Heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory. Williams is the running back next to Howe. Play action. Howe will now lob it down the near side. Newsome with a man all over him. Pins the ball against the back of the defender and brings it in. Heels can get a first down at the 3. Now, pump fake to the right. Now he's going to run to the left. Howe at the 5. Takes the shot. Pinballing off the chains for the touchdown. Sam Howe showing the toughness for 6.
Cardinals down 4, 35-31. May has the shotgun snap. Pressure coming. Rolls to the right.
Goes to the end zone. Touchdown! Touchdown, Antoine Green! 16 seconds to go. No flag.
Snapping it off the 8-yard line. May pulls it, tries to roll to the far side.
Oh, now he's going to throw it and score! Christian May throws it to Payson in the end zone for the touchdown. May throws it late for the left-handed. Was rolling out on the run and threw it left-handed. Nard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Theo at the 35. Theo, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Theo, he's going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
Hey guys, and welcome to another edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, here with you guys as always, and Josh Marlowe alongside of me tonight. That's how you know it's a big edition of the podcast, because tonight it is time to get you ready for spring practice. Now, don't worry. I know many people are saying, man, you guys are coming on live during this tumultuous time in Carolina athletics. If we have any news that comes down on the Hubert Davis front, believe you me, we will break into what we are doing. We will say, hey, we're shutting down the podcast for the night, and we will head over and jump on the Four Corners podcast if need be. So don't worry about that. If something does come down, we are going to be aware of it, and we're going to make the proper decision to pivot and move on to the more important news. But it's pretty important, the start of spring football for Carolina as well. So we're going to be talking you through it tonight. We have 5 questions that we're going to answer about some of the bigger things that, are going on around Tar Heel football heading into spring practice, some important questions that we think need answering. And then we will, of course, be going through and giving you something a little bit different when it comes to looking at each position room. So we are going to take a look at each position room, but we're going to be doing what's called a confidence meter. We've probably seen this done before on other podcasts or on radio shows. We'll just go through, tell you how confident we are in each and every group. So make sure that you stick around for that here tonight on the podcast. But in terms of the information that we know, it's not very much, but just a little information that we know going into spring practice. Carolina is going to have 3 days that the practices are going to be open to the media. It is tomorrow's practice, the practice on April 7th, and then the practice, I believe, on April 21st, if I remember correctly from the email that was sent out here recently by Justin Wilson, the SID, on the football side of things. And so only 3 days to observe this team. That's exactly what they were given last year during the spring. And so the information that's going to be coming out around the program is going to be very, very thin once again this year. It's going to be a lot of light coverage once again, because that's really all that you're going to be allowed to do. They apparently are being even more restrictive, according to some of the stuff that was reported on Inside Carolina by Tommy Ashley last week. They're going to be even more restrictive in terms of what they're going to allow this year. So don't expect there to be a ton of headlines coming out of spring practice. But still, we'll keep you up to date as much as we can. The only media availability for head coach Bill Belichick was when he speaks tomorrow. That will be the only time he is scheduled to speak with the media during the spring. And then we'll see what he ends up doing after that as we head towards fall practice and everything like that. So you're not going to hear from Belichick. You're not going to have a lot of stuff that's coming out around the program in terms of the news and notes like we used to get from Mack Brown. And so it's going to be really hard once again to give you guys a ton of content, but we're going to make sure that we're giving you as much as we possibly can. As of right now, there is no public practice or spring game that has been announced to close the spring practice session. So who knows whether or not they're even going to have a practice like a pro event like they did this past year, or if they're going to have a spring game, a more traditional spring game like they have in the past. And so when you hear the fact that they're cutting off, going to be even more restrictive rather of what people are, be able to share about these practices in terms of the access that they're giving people to these practices. I mean, do you like that strategy from Bill Belichick, or is this just another one of those frustrating elements of the Belichick regime here as we go into year two?
I don't know if it's frustrating. This is the benefit of coaching in college as opposed to the NFL. You can really be in control of how much gets outside of your program's walls, where the NFL, there's just so much that is mandated where there has to be access to at least the media, and then you've got to be behind a microphone. I mean, in training camp, if you will, they're behind a microphone, it feels like, every day, if not every other day, talking about what's going on, because they want their fans to be involved. I think on the surface, this is probably what Belichick wants, where this could just be, hey, we're gonna come in here, we're gonna get our work done, we're not gonna talk about it, we're gonna be about it. But for a fan base that's not happy with what happened last year, that enters this year with a lot of, I think, anxiety about, are things going to be better? You would like to feel like you have access to hearing about that. And that doesn't appear to be on the table as of right now. As you mentioned, it's going to be very limited access, very limited time that you even hear Belichick talk about what's going on. But the best way to make us care less about those types of things is if, when we get to the season, we see a more competitive product on the field. And that was the thing last year when this team was struggling, was you had all the off the field issues, you had all the restrictions to where we weren't informed as much as we were with Mack Brown. But you also weren't winning. Like, if Carolina was winning, we wouldn't have cared. If Carolina was more competitive, we would not have cared. And hopefully that's what's going to happen this year, that this program takes that step, because I think this is a big year on the surface for, if we want this experiment to work, Carolina's got to take a huge step forward off of what they did last year when they went 4-8 with a much more manageable schedule than they've been dealt this upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt that there is an appetite to win based off of some of the reporting, that article that I mentioned from Inside Carolina by Tommy Ashley. There is demands to win this year. If you don't win to a certain extent, then they will be in the mindset of possibly flushing this and just going out and finding a new regime to come in here and take over and at least try to start building some positive momentum. And so this group has to win. There's no doubt about that. And so, I mean, as you said, I think that's the thing that everybody really is wondering is this going to be different than last year? And when you hear that, it's going to be very restrictive again, we're not going to be talking much to the media. I think the bigger concern is that they're going to be even more restrictive in terms of what the media is able to do when they are at these practices. Because, I mean, look, I get it. You don't want anybody to be able to, decipher what they're going to see on the field, in terms of opponents and everything like that. But don't you want your fans to have some sort of feeling for what their team is going to look like? have some sort of familiarity with the players that are playing well and who they're going to be seeing on Saturdays. And so, that again, they are not going to have the numbers on the practice jerseys this year. So even if you do end up getting a spring game, it's going to be, or, a practice like the pro event, it is going to be, very difficult to tell who is who out there on the field. That's one thing that they're going to make difficult again this year. And so I get it from a certain aspect where you want to do your things and you were able, even though it didn't necessarily work last year, you're hoping that things are going to work a little bit differently this year. But at the same time, I think you want to have more access to your program for the fan base, because I think the fan base needs a little something to get them excited for the season. Because right now, I mean, just speaking for myself as we sit here, I mean, the excitement level for this football season is pretty low. Like, the expectations are not really through the roof. And, we'll talk about it here a little bit later when we talk about the position groups and everything like that. A big part of that is because we just don't know how much talent is on this team. It would help if you got some of those tidbits that you used to get from Mac Brown. I'm not saying that it's got to be Bill Belichick that gives those to you, but hopefully a guy like Bobby Petrino is maybe a little bit more open. We would love for Steven Belichick to be open, but he's just like his dad. You're not really going to get anything out of him. And we'd love some of those notes to come out from these practices, from Inside Carolina, from Tar Heel 24/7, these sites that do a great job of covering the team. We'd like for some of those to come out so we can actually get a feeling for what this team is ultimately going to look like this year. So that's where my disappointment lies. And that's why I look at it and say, you would like to see a little bit more open communication between the football program and its fan base, because I think it's fair to say that they at least owe the fan base that after what we saw in the first season.
No, there's no doubt about that. You don't have the luxury that you had last year where everyone was curious what this was going to look like. You don't have, you have a real interesting season opener because you're opening against TCU over in Ireland. So if this game was being played in Fort Worth, I don't know what the interest would be in that game. And, we saw what last year looked like, and it wasn't pretty for the most part. It got really good in the middle part of the schedule. But you lost your final 3 games of the year to in-state opponents that really deflated all the progress it felt like they made, getting into when they put themselves in the position to go to a bowl game. But they weren't able to capitalize on that, losing to Duke, Wake, and State, to close out the year. And so, and then you combine that with they didn't have the transfer portal that we thought they were going to have the second time around. Like, we were able to kind of excuse why they didn't have a big transfer portal haul their first time. But I mean, I thought they would be able to have a much bigger impact in their second go at it. And they chose to bring in a bunch of, they chose to prioritize a big high school recruiting class, which, does not equal winning, right off the bat. You don't win in college football with freshmen. You just don't. And you win with juniors and seniors, and you win by supplementing talent and depth to your roster via the transfer portal. So they enter kind of as an unknown. They enter kind of as a mystery because we don't know how much talent's on the roster. We don't know how good this team is capable of being, but we can look at the schedule and just project and say, if they don't take a sizable step forward, we could be in for another long season. And I don't think when, Carolina made the move 2 years ago to bring Belichick in, they would have envisioned maybe 2 4-8 seasons to get this thing rolling. Like, they made the move to be as all in financially as they've been in football, with the hopes of there being winning on the back end. That wasn't the case in year one, and we'll have to wait and see what's on the horizon in year two. But as I sit here and I'm looking at the upcoming season, I would be thrilled if they made a bowl game. Like if they went 6-6, I would be ecstatic. And I don't think that's how I would. That's not how I felt 20 months ago or whatever when Carolina hired Bill Belichick to be the football coach.
Yeah, no, you felt like they were making a commitment to football like they never had before. And so, I mean, yeah, you said 20 months. Believe it or not, it's only been 15. I mean, that's the thing. It feels like it's been longer. It feels like it has been forever under Bill Belichick because, man, it's just there's so many headlines that you've had off the field. It hasn't been great on the field. It felt like that football season last year took forever. And you're right. You could be back in the same spot again this year because, yeah, is the talent level better? I saw this in that article again that I keep referencing from Inside Carolina. They said that they believe that the talent level is better for this year. And I mean, maybe that's the case, but a lot of it is freshman talent. And so you're right. I think that's going to be really interesting. And that's why you would love for these news and notes type of things to come out of practice to tell you, hey, so-and-so is progressing well. This group is surprising. That's what you would love to see because I think last year there was nothing coming out and it didn't matter. Because we knew that first game of the year, everybody was going to be locked in. Look at the spectacle that first game of the season was. I mean, that was one of the most highly visible games that Carolina football has ever played, if not the most highly visible that Carolina has ever played in terms of not only being on national television, but also all of the different people that were there for that game, that were, big time celebrities, everything like that. It was something like we've never seen before. And so this year you're expecting that, hey, I mean, I guess they're thinking it's going to be very similar in terms of the opener being overseas against TCU in Ireland. I'm going to tell you, yeah, there might be some people that are excited to see that first game of the season just because it's the first game of the college football season. There is nowhere near the excitement that there was around the program last year. And that's not only from the general college football fan, that's from a Tar Heel fan perspective as well. So I think having some of those things to get excited about, some of these reports that come out, or, just Bill Belichick telling you himself, or, his coordinators breaking some of these guys down, maybe that would help, but we're not really going to get much going into this, going into spring practice. So yeah, it's frustrating, but it is what it is with this group that is in place. All right, let's get to the 5 questions that we have heading into spring ball. I think there's really a bunch of questions that you could ask about this team, but these were really the 5 that popped into my head when I was going through. And I think, first of all, I mentioned the talent on the roster. Is there enough talent on the roster to win at the rate that they need to this season? There is a demand for Carolina to win. And when they say there's a demand for them to win, I don't think that means that they will that going 4-8 again this season is going to be met with excitement. I think that means that they want Carolina to be in a bowl game. You talked about it. In order to get to that point, it is going to have to be a much more talented roster because Carolina is going to need to be able to win some games that you would look at on paper right now and probably think that Carolina isn't going to necessarily win. They are going to need to find a way to get into a bowl game, I think, in order to satisfy the people that are looking at this experiment and wondering whether or not it should be over after 2 years. And so, I think they did a good job of going out and getting some talented guys at the high school level, but is that the right type of talent for this team to be successful this year? I think that's the big question going into spring practice.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I would say that I think they've got a better chance just because I think the quarterback room isn't going to be as bad as it was a year ago with the guys you were able to add, via the portal. And granted, you added 3 quarterbacks in the portal, but I do think there's a case to be made that all 3 can be better than Gio Lopez. And look, I thought Gio made some strides down the stretch when Carolina was improving, but there's also denying if he would have played better down the stretch. Maybe Carolina wins 2 of those games and they get to a bowl game, and maybe that sets them up for a bigger year too. So I think ultimately we're gonna have to wait and see. But I think the fact that I think we feel better about the quarterback room today than we did after going through last year. And I feel a lot better about Carolina's offensive play caller than I ever felt about last year with Freddie Kitchens. I do think gives Carolina a chance, because if you know anything about Bobby Petrino, he's never struggled to put up points. He's never struggled to put up yards. His offenses have always been competent. They've always been at least average. And the Carolina's offense last year was not average. It was arguably the worst offense of any power conference team in college football, which is why they struggle so mightily. I still think there might be some depth issues on this team that might hinder them if they suffer injuries. And we know this game is a game of attrition. But I think upgrading the quarterback room, and we got to see who does emerge as the eventual starter. But we know how important that position, and it's the most important position in sports. Just the fact that you feel better about whoever's going to be taking snaps and shotgun in that first game of the year, you feel like is a definite upgrade over Gio Lopez, I do think gives Carolina at least a fighting chance to win at least 6 games and get to a bowl game.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there is enough talent on this roster to be able to get them to a bowl game this year. I think the thing is that it's unfortunately you're going to have to rely on a lot of young talent. And so you just hope that they grow up quickly. And I think it's possible that it ends up happening. But I mean, you look at what we've seen in the past in college football, and there's not really a team that you can point to and say with a bunch of young talent, they end up winning. So again, I think it is possible, but I think that's at, that's best case scenario. That is Carolina really has a bunch of things break right for them. The schedule, I mean, look, it's difficult going in. We know that, each and every year, the schedule can look daunting on paper to begin the season, and then it can look a completely different way as you go throughout the season. Carolina's got to hope that's also the case. Carolina's got to hope that some teams that were really good last year, some teams that look like they're going to be good again this year, don't necessarily pan out. That's how you get to the point where you can get, where I think they need to get to, which is 6-6 and make a bowl game. Outside of that, I don't know if Carolina has that talent has enough talent on the roster to be able to get there. When I look at it from the realistic scenario, I think they're going to be back probably where they were last year. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that, when you look on the offensive line in particular, you don't see a group that you really feel very confident in. Talent-wise, I think that's the one area. You talk about every other area. You talk about them not going out in the portal and getting a bunch of big-name guys. I think for the most part, they did a pretty decent job just about everywhere else. They handled this roster about as well as you could have with the limitations that you had because of the money that you had spent on the high school recruiting class and the scholarships that you had spent with that high school recruiting class. And so I think the offensive line, though, is the big concern because you got one guy that legitimately you look at and say is guaranteed to be a starter. And that is Andrew Threet, the transfer from Charleston Southern, who is expected to play right tackle. And you look at him, I mean, yeah, he's a guy that brings some promise to the table, but even still not great in pass protection this past year. It's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle for him coming up to this level as well. And so those things combined, I just don't know whether or not he's going to be able to succeed. I think that offensive line is really the biggest concern for Carolina going into the year. And then, 2 losses on the defensive line. You lose 2 guys, CJ Mims and DeAndre Robinson, who were big parts of what you did last season. You lose both of those guys late in the portal cycle. And I mean, look, there are some talented guys that we've talked about at that defensive line position from this 2026 recruiting class that Carolina is bringing in. But at the same time, you're expecting a lot from those guys at a young age. And so I think that's what when you look at where Carolina really needs to hope and pray that things go right for them to be able to take a massive step, it's in the trenches. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best strategy to take going into a season. It's just, bringing in guys that, you hope are serviceable enough and then just praying that they end up panning out. So that's the reason why I'm still a little down on the talent on the roster. I don't think, I don't think there's any argument against the fact that they are better than last year. I think that they have more talent than they did last year, just based off of what they brought in the high school recruiting class. But at the same time, I don't know just how impactful it's going to be this year. It might be something that would pan out a little bit further down the line. But the question is, do they have time for it to actually pan out? Do they have time for another bad season and then find out what happens moving forward? You mentioned Bobby Petrino. One of the big questions I think going into spring practice is just how impactful Bobby Petrino's hire is going to be for this offense. I mean, yeah, you mentioned he's a guy that's done a really good job of getting having success while having less talent on the roster than some of these other offensive coordinator hires that we were looking at from a Carolina perspective. He's a guy that's done more with less. And so is that going to be the same thing here in Chapel Hill? I think if he's able to come in and have the impact that we think he's going to be able to, at least I think he's going to be able to, maybe that's the reason that Carolina's able to get to a bowl game, is because of what this offense eventually becomes.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued to see what Carolina's offense looks like under him. Because if you go back to, his time in college football, like for us, like I remember him being at, he was at Louisville, Arkansas, back to Louisville, back to Arkansas. He's been really fun, and he's been really creative and ahead of the curve. Like it feels like every time the game changes, he's changing he's ahead of the changes, and he sees what the RPO was like with Lamar Jackson, and just knows how to scheme his talent and get the most out of it. I mean, I said it last year, when Carolina made the move and they hired him, I think had he been the coordinator last year, I think Carolina's offense would have done enough to go to a bowl game. I think you would have seen a better version of Gio Lopez. That's why I was open to Gio coming back when Carolina made the hire, because I felt like he was a more natural fit for his offense. I think what's going to be really interesting is how much is Belichick going to let him do his thing, because when this offense is humming, they can be ball control, but they can also play with tempo, and they can move up and down the field in a real quick manner. Does Belichick, do they adapt to that? Because Carolina's offense last year was so methodical. They try and they tried to shorten games, shorten possessions, and that was because they had to. But when you don't score, it makes it harder for you to win. Where, the NFL, you have 8 to 10 possessions in a football game. In college, you have about 14. With the way that the clock operates and the way that most teams play with pace. And so can Carolina maybe have more cracks at it? Maybe they score a lot more points. So look, everywhere he's gone, he's been successful. I've never watched his offense fail. So I think it's just trying to figure out what does success look like for him? Because if this offense averages more than 24 points per game, if they average more than 350 yards per game, I think that's a real big step in the right direction from where they were a year ago, where them getting to 20 felt like a chore. And so we'll have to wait and see. But this is why I'm disappointed that we don't have the access, because I would love to hear what's coming out from what this offense is doing and how this offense looks like. Hopefully, they give us some bite of the apple with a spring game, practice like a pro event, something like that, where we can get a glimpse. I'd hate to have to wait all the way to the first TCU game to see what this offense looks like under Petrino, but I do think that they are poised, even with the concerns among the offensive line. I think they are poised to take a big step in the right direction and look like an offense that you see week in, week out in the ACC. With where the quarterback plays gotten to here in this conference.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the offense is going to look better. It's just a question of how much better do they honestly look? Do they have enough talent to be able to give Bobby Petrino what he needs to be able to succeed at the level that we've seen him succeed before? I think there probably is going to be enough talent on the offensive side of the ball for him to be able to do that at the skill positions. It all comes down to that offensive line. But I trust that he's going to be able to work around certain things. Now, it's going to be tough if the offensive line is just a complete disaster this year. We're hoping that isn't necessarily going to be the case. Even if you get the type of line play that you did this past year, which was not good. But I think if you get that type of line play, I really believe that he's going to be able to do something with that. You just trust. I mean, you talked about it. Everywhere that he's been, he's found a way to be pretty successful with what he's doing. I mean, you look at most recently, the stops that he had. I mean, Arkansas this past year, I think, is a great example where they didn't necessarily have the greatest talent based off of where they've been recruiting in recent years. It hasn't been on the same level as some of those teams in the SEC. Same thing with the transfers that they've been bringing in. That was still one of the SEC's better offenses this past year. And so he is able to work some magic with these guys, no matter what position they're put into. I think the other thing that you're going to see from that's going to be so much different than what Freddie Kitchens did a year ago is Freddie Kitchens never adjusted his offense to his personnel. It was Freddie Kitchens' system. You have to run whatever Freddie Kitchens is telling you. And, if it works, great. If not, well, we're going to continue to do what we're doing. And hopefully we find guys that fit the system that we are running. This is going to be a system that's going to adjust to the guys that are a part of it. And that's going to be really interesting to see. It's going to play to the strengths of whatever quarterback is in there. It's going to play to the strengths of whichever wide receiver is on the field opposite of Jordan Shipp, whoever's in the slot. Those are the things that I think are going to be so much different this year, and is why I feel so much more confident in this offense going into this season. But you're right. This is where you wish you had some of those notes coming out to tell you where exactly the offense is for Bobby Petrino's group. Are they progressing the way that they should be? Is there a quarterback that's sort of taking hold, at least with, this group that's going to be there in the spring? Those are the types of questions and answers that you wish you would have, but it's just going to end up being questions. It's just going to end up being questions that are going to go unanswered. You'll have no clue until you actually see this team take the field for the first time in Ireland, whether or not this team is legit on the offensive side of the ball. And as you said, I'd like to get that public practice that, the fan base is allowed to go to. Last year they did a lot of team drills, a lot of 11 on 11. And so you really got a good look at what Carolina was bringing to the table at that time. As of right now, as we said earlier, we don't think that's on the table. They don't have that scheduled. And so, that's something that's a little disappointing. Hopefully that's something that they will reveal to the public here soon. And we actually do get a look at how good Bobby Petrino's offense looks here as we go throughout the spring. I mentioned the quarterback position. One of the things that I think is important, one of the questions that you have to ask here is, can any quarterback emerge from the group that will be there in spring practice? Now, even if somebody does emerge and they come out and unless they just absolutely burn it up, I mean, we're talking about put on a show similar to what you saw with Sam Howell when he was competing for the job back in 2019, then I don't think you're going to be able to say that person is the starter heading into fall camp. Because remember, Taron Dickens is coming in after transferring in from Western Carolina. He will not be with the team in the spring, but will be with the team when he joins them in the summer. And so I'm not looking for my starting quarterback to be named after spring practice is over, but I'm looking for someone to sort of separate themselves from that group, especially from the two transfers that are coming in Billy Edwards Jr. and Miles O'Neill. You'd like to see one of those guys sort of take a step forward, maybe Travis Burgess. I'm not sure where exactly he is in terms of his recovery and whether or not he's going to be a full go for spring practice. Would love to get some clarity on that, but of course, that does not seem like that's going to be coming out. But, that could be another guy that could potentially be a factor. And even Arturi Newkirk, who threw earlier today at Tar Heel Pro Day, maybe he's going to be in there. I'd like to see someone from that group sort of separate themselves here as we go throughout the spring. And I think there is one candidate that sticks out to me that I think would be able to do that, based off of what we've seen so far from him. But, I think that's still to be determined.
Yeah, I think you would like to know going in between your two transfers that you have with you in the spring, who's maybe ahead of who, because I do think, I don't think Dickens came here to just sit on the bench and hold a clipboard. As late as addition as he was in the portal, I do think he came here with the mindset of competing for a starting job. It's just unfortunate that because of when he committed in the portal, cannot be, enrolled, in here for the spring, won't join the team until the summer. To me, I think you're really looking primarily at Miles O'Neill, the A&M transfer, and then Billy Edwards Jr., the Wisconsin transfer. I think Burgess is the future of this room. If I had to say, probably going to be more of like a medical redshirt type of year for him, where if he gets healthy, they're going to let him get some reps in practice, but really just let him kind of make sure he gets 100% healthy. Maybe look at 2027 as a chance for him to really be a factor in this room. When we were talking about this back earlier in the off season, you were a lot higher on Billy Edwards Jr. than I was. I look at Miles O'Neill as someone that has the relationship with Bobby Petrino. That's the one that I'm more believed in that could emerge over here in the spring. But there's no doubt about it. Carolina will enter fall camp when they go, and it'll be in late July. They'll have another quarterback battle on their hands. It's just, how many quarterbacks are you trying to decide between? You would like it to be down to two quarterbacks as opposed to three. If we get to late July and Belichick is telling you this is a wide open competition, no one has emerged, then I think that would be somewhat concerning, because I don't know if they'd be able to get a quarterback established, ready to go by the open, that you'd feel confident gives you a legitimate chance to win that game against TCU. And I think that game, we've seen it. The teams that win over there go on to have really good seasons. The teams that lose, they usually come back and they never really recover. So this game is going to set the tone for Carolina right out of the gate. So if I had to bet, it would be Miles O'Neill, the A&M guy, but I can't say that I'm confident that he's going to separate himself enough to where we're not talking about at least a three-way quarterback battle when we get to fall camp in late July.
Yeah, I mean, look, the game against TCU is absolutely crucial, because you look at the schedule that Carolina has. That's one of the easiest games that's on the schedule. Remember, they lost Josh Hoover from last year. So they're going to be replacing him. They're going to be replacing a pretty decent amount of NFL talent that was on that roster as well, especially on the defensive side of the football. You've got to have a guy ready to go for that opener, and he's going to be the guy. There's no, we're playing two quarterbacks, we're playing three quarterbacks. No. You need to be playing one quarterback by that time. And so, yeah, I'd love for this group to have someone that sort of separates themselves. You know, the best case scenario would be for Travis Burgess or Miles O'Neill to separate themselves. They're the youngest. They're guys that would be able to lock down that position for years to come. That would make the most sense for Carolina if that was to end up happening. But what's more likely, and what I wouldn't hate it. It would be what it is, and he would be a guy that would be there for 1 year. But if you can get Billy Edwards Jr. to create some sort of separation, then I feel like maybe you still feel pretty good going into that game against TCU. I know he's not the greatest quarterback out there. I know he's not a guy that's really going to take you to the next level. But if he can improve based off of what we saw from him as a starter 2 years ago when he was at Maryland, and he can really take another step, then I think we're talking about a guy that could be very serviceable as a quarterback in the ACC. I mean, if you could get somewhere in that area of maybe, 23 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, throw for somewhere around, 3,000 yards, something like that, I feel like you're probably pretty comfortable with that if you're Carolina. And so that's the guy that I think is the most realistic to separate himself. But as I said, I would much rather have a guy like Travis Burgess, like Miles O'Neill, separate themselves and really show that, hey, we're going to be the guys that are heading up this race when we get into the fall. We're going to be, guys that can potentially win this battle and then be the future moving forward. I mean, especially a guy like Miles O'Neill, who was, brought in by Bobby Petrino, but even, Travis Burgess, I think is the future of that position. So I think that's what you're hoping for if you're a Carolina fan. But the reality is that you are more than likely going to go in with maybe, 2 quarterbacks that emerge from the spring, and then that third quarterback that will be the mystery that is Taron Dickens and what exactly he ends up turning into at the FBS level after coming from the FCS level. And so I think that's probably where this group will go into the fall at. Will be probably a 3-man race, but we can hope that maybe Carolina comes out with someone that has clearly separated themselves and will make it even difficult on Taron Dickens to be able to win that job when he comes in the fall. All right, you move on to question number 4. Who needs to emerge as the leaders on the defensive side of the ball? Look, I think there are plenty of answers to this question. We've seen there are a lot of guys that left on the defensive side of the ball. And so, there's very clear names like Milcart Abugiade. The thing is that Milcart, what we saw from him last year, what we saw when he would speak to the media, not the most vocal guy. So you need some other guys that are going to be able to emerge on that defensive side of the ball. I think it's very, very important that you see some of those leaders start to come forward as we go throughout fall, or as we go throughout the spring, rather. I think that's going to be one of the main storylines that we're following. And one of the ways that luckily you'll kind of be able to tell this is who they end up putting up on the stand to talk to the media after some of these practices as we go throughout the spring here over the next month or so.
Yeah, that was kind of the telltale sign that we got last year when they put someone up there. That's how that was their staff's way of telling you, hey, this guy is. They earned the right to talk to the media. We trust that person to talk to the media and represent the program the way they want the program to be represented. Yeah, getting Milcart Abugiade back was, the biggest win of the offseason defensively for Carolina. That's losing, I don't know how much talent necessarily they are losing, but you're losing some people that, you counted a lot on last year. Kamori House no longer here. Andrew Simpson no longer here. You go back to the defensive backfield, like Marcus Allen, for all of his inconsistencies, been here for quite a bit. Thaddeus Dixon, I thought he was a guy that the injury really hindered this defense because there was a leadership quality, there was an attitude that I thought Carolina was lacking without him on the field. You brought in, a slew of transfers. on the defensive side of the football. And you maybe are going to want some of those guys to emerge as leaders. Looking at Darren McDonald from Syracuse, but I think you got to look at guys that are back for the program for a second year, and guys that at different points last year played solid football up front for Carolina. A guy like Leroy Jackson, a guy like Isaiah Johnson, where they showed glimpses. They had moments where they could be at least ACC caliber defensive linemen, and that's really where it starts and ends. You mentioned the two guys that Carolina lost late in the portal; those were killers, man. Like losing Mims, losing Dontre Robinson, just it took some depth out of that room, and it took some guys that you saw last year when the defense was really playing up to par. That defensive line took a collective step forward. And then the final 3 games, they kind of got worn down. They got pushed around as they kind of got ran all over. But I think that's going to be the thing. I think the Belichick showed last year. I thought they adapted as the season moved along to how to get the most out of the defense. After the first month, the defense looked lost. They were giving up points. They were giving up yards left and right. And then by the middle part of the year, it looked like a Belichick defense. Carolina was sound. Their tackling was better. They were in the right gaps. They were doing the things that they had to do. But some of those guys are no longer here. We hear this all the time in basketball. I think the same thing applies in football. You can't be a good team if you're a quiet team, especially defensively. So who's going to emerge as that voice? Who's going to be the guy that makes sure Carolina's aligned, make sure people are doing what they're supposed to do? Who's going to hold people accountable when they mess up, when they miss an assignment? That's a big part of it too. I thought Carolina liked that at different times last year. So I think that at some point they'll figure it out defensively. They'll be good enough to give Carolina a chance to win. But as we hear all the time, the best teams are the player-led teams. Who is going to be those other guys along Melchior Bougeday that'll lead Carolina's defense in 2026? If those guys emerge, I believe in the coaching pedigree to where Carolina's defense could take a step forward the way it needs to put them in a position to compete for a bowl game.
And look, a guy like Jaden Patterson, who, I think is already looking like he's going to be a big part of what Carolina does in the secondary. This year, he's going to be the starter at corner, and he is the one starter at corner that for sure is going to be out there. I mean, he's the first guy that's going to be on the stand media-wise for the defense. And so I think that shows that he's one of the guys that they're looking to step up, or that they feel like has already stepped up in that area. Defensive line, we talked about, the 2 losses that Carolina has. You still got Leroy Jackson. You still got Isaiah Johnson. Those are guys that have to be a little bit more vocal this year. They have to lead that defensive line group. You went out and got some experience at linebacker. You went and got Derek McDonald out of Syracuse. That's got to be a guy that's vocal. That's got to be a guy that's talking, that's trying to get everything set up for Carolina. And even, a guy like Peyton Seelman, who comes over from Richmond. I mean, he's a junior, but he's a guy that's been doing it for a couple years now. He's got to be someone that can help set up Carolina on the defensive side of the football as well. And so I think those are the areas that you're looking at. And, can somebody emerge at that safety spot? Is there somebody that, either played a lot last year, played a decent amount last year, like a Greg Smith that could be in line for a bigger role this year? Maybe he's a guy that becomes sort of a vocal leader, or maybe you see, somebody like a Coleman Bryson, who, we saw play towards the end of last year. He's a veteran as well in that room. Maybe he ends up standing up. The other thing is that if some of these young guys are going to get on the field, they've got to be leaders as well. They've got to be guys that, even though they are young, they still feel like they can hold guys accountable. They still feel like they can be the vocal leaders on that side of the football. I think that side of the football is the one that you trust more. There's no doubt about that. I think it's the one that you actually feel pretty decent about in certain respects. I think, there is still that mystery of what exactly certain guys that you brought out of the transfer portal are going to be. But I think for the most part, people feel pretty good about that side of the football. Now it's just about getting those leaders that emerge. And so that's going to be one of the things that's going to be really interesting to see as we go throughout the spring. Who are some of those guys that are getting to speak to the media, that are getting to, or that are showing up as some of those guys that are leading, warm-ups and stuff like that. Who are some of those guys that the media is noticing are becoming some of those leaders out there, even with this limited access as they're getting? All right, last question here on before we get to the confidence meter on each position room. Which battle or battles are the most important to monitor this spring outside of quarterback? I think there's a ton of different ones that you could pick. There's so many that I think are going to be very important. But when you look at the battles that Carolina has right now in camp, is there one that really sticks out to you outside of the quarterback room that has you excited going into the spring?
Yeah, I'll take one on both sides of the football. Let's start with the offense. It's not even a battle. It's just more about who outside of Jordan Shipp is going to emerge as someone that I can trust Carolina to throw the football to, because this room is, I'm not saying that it doesn't have talent, but there's not a lot of production in the room outside of Shipp. You know how good he is, you know how important he is. And I expect him to have a much bigger year this year than he had a year ago. But there isn't. If you go look at these guys as you go look at the box scores or whatever from the previous stops, it's not like their numbers are going to blow you away. Now I think it does. They have the fit and the mold of guys that kind of do what Belichick's offenses did in New England. I think you've got some more guys in the slot that Carolina will be able to maximize and really be able to scheme up some guys, get some guys on some linebackers, and really attack defenses the way that our defense gets attacked, it feels like, on a week in, week out basis. But this isn't the room that it was in the Mac Brown era, where you felt confident across the board. You had like three legitimate ones at different times, with De'Ami Brown, Daz Newsome, Paysor at different times in his career, J.J. Jones, the list goes on and on, where Carolina was just so deep and talented at that position where they could just rotate guys in and there wasn't a lack of production on the field at times. I do worry about that, but I think the Petrino impact will really kind of overshadow that. I think his offense will produce the type of stats that you need. And then defensively, it's who's going to be that pass rusher opposite Melchior Dibujiday. That it cannot just be all on him to get pressure on the quarterback. And I think what you saw with Stephen Belichick is when he felt like he had no choice but to blitz to send pressure, he obviously was willing to do that. But this is a defense that wants to be able to get home with 4 and then really drop as many guys into coverage, because that's where they play chess, with the way that they disguise their coverages, the ability to really confuse quarterbacks and win that battle at the line of scrimmage. That's only possible, though, if someone else, emerges opposite him. Of course, Price Yates, had the injury that really hindered him from ever becoming that. I think had he not been injured, I think Carolina's pass rush would have been a lot better collectively. So that's going to be something that's going to have to emerge, because we can talk about the skill position groups. We can talk about, the back seven on the defense. What's going to determine Carolina's ultimate success is how far they come in the trenches, because as we saw in the final 3 games last year against State, Wake, and Duke, they got a long ways to go if they want to be the type of football team they aspire to be under Bill Belichick.
Well, I agree with you. And I think that's why, if I'm going with one on each side of the ball, I'll go with the starting offensive line. And you may say, well, that's not a position. That's not a position battle. Oh, it's the entire offensive line. That's the thing. I think there is one starter that is locked in. I think Christo Kelly is the one guy that you can look at and say is going to start for Carolina this year. They feel pretty confident in him. They also look at him as one of the leaders on the offensive side of the ball, according to some of the reporting from inside Carolina. Outside of that, that's it. You don't have anybody else that you're guaranteed. You got Aiden Banfield coming back. I would love to know what's the story on Aiden Banfield. Did he get hurt last year? Or was he just a guy that fell out of favor with the coaching staff and now he's coming back? Because if he was hurt, then great. Then, that he was injured. He's healthy now and he's back. Hopefully he's going to be a big part of what they do. If he fell out of favor with the coaching staff, man, it's going to be hard to have confidence that he's going to be a guy that's going to be able to slide back in there and that this coaching staff is going to believe in for the majority of the season. I mean, his play was not great when he was in there. I mean, the stats tell you that it wasn't a great start to the season for him. And so we'll have to see what he becomes, but he's far from a guarantee that he's going to be successful if he's out there. Andrew Threet, like I said, I like certain elements of his game. I do think that there's a reason that Carolina brought him in the transfer portal. But at the same time, I do question him in some respects as a pass protector. And so I do think that that's going to be an area where Carolina is going to have to work on with him. They're going to need him to be better than he was at Charleston Southern, or even just what he was there. If he could put up similar statistics, it might be just enough to get Carolina by. But certainly cannot be what Carolina saw towards the end of the season from a guy like Ja'Kai Moore, who dropped off as the year went along and ultimately was one of the big undoings of Carolina late in the season, was that they simply could not pass protect. They couldn't run block for most of the year. So he needs to be better than that. And then the other two spots, I mean, you're basically starting from scratch. There's not a guy that really sticks out there, because I think Aiden Banfield, if he starts, probably going to be back at that left guard spot. So that means right guard and left tackle. I mean, we're starting fresh. We have no idea who's going to be at those positions. Maybe Jordan Hall is back there for Carolina at left tackle. He wasn't great. He was far from great this past year for Carolina at that left tackle spot. So you'd like to have an upgrade over him, or you'd like for him to get that much better to where he actually ends up being serviceable. But that's far from a guarantee. So I'm going to be really interested in that position room to monitor, see if there's any sort of tidbits that we get throughout fall camp. I keep saying fall camp, spring practice, and see whether or not Carolina, can find a group that they trust down there. I'm not saying you got to leave spring practice with a starting five, but can you at least have a group of five that you feel relatively comfortable with? Maybe there is a guy or two that's battling with the guy that is part of the main five for Carolina at that left tackle spot or that right guard spot, but you don't want to leave with just complete mystery in the same spot that you enter camp in along that offensive line. And then, on the defensive side of the ball, I think it's that starting cornerback spot opposite of Jaden Patterson. I think that's one that is going to be fascinating, because you brought in a D. Willie out of the transfer portal. He's a guy that, towards the end of his career at Michigan State actually made the transition to safety. So now he's going to have to transition back. That's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing. When he was at corner, he was a guy that got lit up according to the statistics of his time there at Michigan State. So is he going to be improved in that area? So then that leads me to the group of holdovers that are there for Carolina. Ty Adams, who we've seen, sparingly at times for Carolina over these last handful of years. A guy that hasn't necessarily been great when he's been on the field. And then Jalen Thompson, a guy that we saw out there a little bit last year, but not enough to get a real assessment on. Or either one of those guys going to step up and be able to take the position? Or could it be a true freshman like Kenton Dobson? Could that be a guy that really steps in? He's the highest rated player for Carolina in this past year's class. Is he a guy that really comes out and burns it up for Carolina right at the start? Because if he does, then Carolina's got a chance to really succeed this year, because I think Jaden Patterson is a really good corner based off of what we saw from him this past year. You find that second guy, then I think you're really cooking with something on that defensive side of the ball. So we'll see if anybody can create some sort of separation there as we go throughout spring practice. All right, guys, now it's time to get to the confidence meter on with the entire roster here. Again, we're just going to go position group by position group. We'll give, our it's on a scale of 1 to 10. How confident are you in that room? And then you will just explain why you are, as confident in that room as you are, or as down on that room as you are. So pretty simple here. We'll go with quarterback to start out. Where do you have your confidence level in that room going in?
I think I'll put it at a 7 going in, not knowing, who the quarterback is going to be today. We won't know who the quarterback is going to be probably until the team departs to go overseas, if we're being honest. That's probably how long they will drag this thing out. Not ideal, but we know how Belichick, they're going to want to play this thing close to the chest. No matter who emerges, and I think I know who I want to emerge, I think that player is going to be a significant upgrade over Gio Lopez. And I don't mean that as negative against Gio as it sounds. It became apparent he did not have what it takes to play at this level. Now, Wake Forest didn't think so. That's why he stayed within the conference. We'll have to see what he looks like, as a Demon Deacon. But I don't think he had the physical tools to play at the ACC level. I think the 3 guys that Carolina added, even if Travis Burgess emerges as a freshman, I think all 4 of those guys are better equipped, are poised to give the type of production you're used to seeing from the quarterback spot from Carolina, from the Larry Fedora era on, because last year it felt like watching the offense when Nathan Elliott was our quarterback many moons ago, when that offense under Fedora really struggled to be explosive. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. If Carolina is able to solidify that offensive line, I do think you're going to get better quarterback play, even though we don't know who that quarterback is as of right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they're going to get better quarterback play. There's no doubt about that. That's a pretty low bar, considering how bad it was at certain times last year. I would say I'd go with a 5. I just don't know where this group is at coming in. It's a collection of guys. There's no doubt about that. But I think one of the things that you're wondering is, when it comes to Billy Edwards Jr., is he a guy that's going to be able to improve off of what he did at Maryland, or is he going to be the guy that basically he was at Maryland? Because that's borderline serviceable starter. That's a guy that's maybe could get you to a bowl game with a normal schedule, but with this schedule, maybe gets you back to where you were this past year at 4-8. Miles O'Neill, is he the 4-star that he was coming out of high school? I don't know that he necessarily is. We have to wait and see whether or not he can prove to the coaching staff that he is. If he is, then Carolina is in a much better spot, but that's an uncertainty at this point. Travis Burgess, I love Travis Burgess. I think there's a lot of potential there, but where exactly is he at health-wise? That's going to be the biggest thing about this group, and that's one of the reasons why, again, I don't feel overly confident in the group going into the spring. And then Arturi Newkirk, we saw him a little bit last year. We didn't, it wasn't the greatest introduction to him, albeit, there's a lot of pressure on the table for a guy that's stepping into that type of situation. I mean, he was in mop-up duty in those games, but still, I mean, I don't think, who knows if he even expected to be in there over a guy like Bryce Baker. And so, I think that's really what's interesting going into this spring is that, even without Taron Dickens, and I think it'll be interesting to do this maybe once you get to the fall with this group, when Dickens is a part of the room. I think you look at this collection of guys that you have here, and you feel like it's better than what you had last year with all the different guys, especially in the spring when you had Bryce Baker and Ryan Brown, the transfer from Purdue. But I just don't know how much better it is than what you got last year from Gio Lopez at the position. Again, I think Billy Edwards Jr. would be an upgrade, but I don't know how significant of an upgrade that is. And that's the guy that going in, I probably have the most confidence in the room. So I will have it at a 5 as we sit here today. All right, running back. Now, where's your confidence in that room?
Yeah, I think now maybe going a 7 for the quarterback might have been a little bit too high because I think I've got the running back probably at a 7, because you know what you got in Damon June. Now, there needs to be some more explosiveness. I would love to see if he added some more to his game because as good as he was a year ago, Carolina's running game just there was just no explosive ability. It was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. They earned and they churned yardage. Now you got Benjamin Hall back. You've added Caleb Jackson from LSU. And then you've got some talented guys in the backfield as well, like a Jalen McGill, along with some freshmen that you brought in. Like, I think you've got some talent and you've got some depth. It's just right now not a whole lot of proven. Benjamin Hall didn't do a whole lot for Carolina a year ago. Caleb Jackson was a former big recruiting piece at LSU, just never really panned out during his time in Baton Rouge. Does he show up in Chapel Hill, run pissed off, run angry, and really gives Carolina that second back? But I think June is poised to have a better year because I don't think Bobby Petrino is going to go away from him. Like if June is having those games that he's having where he's getting 5-6 yards a pop, then they're going to line up and they're going to run the ball. As opposed to how many times last year did Carolina quit feeding him? Like, he would have a great series, in comes Davian Goss, or Carolina would start having to throw the football because they were down 2 possessions or whatever. So I would probably put it at a 7 right now. I think you'll get, I think Petrino will be able to scheme up some better stuff, get these guys on the edges a little bit more. But they do need to find, I think, that second, the back that they can count on, and not do the whole rotation that they did a year ago, which hindered the whole entire running back room, including June at times, to find a consistent rhythm.
Yeah, I go with an 8. I think with Damon June leading the unit, I think you feel really, really confident in him. I think he's a guy that you're hoping that this offseason, maybe found a little bit of that burst, maybe found some of those that home run hitting ability that we saw at times last year. Now, part of it is that his offensive line has to help him out and he's got to be able to block. But you'd like to see him be someone that can do a little bit more off tackle. That's what you're looking for from him this year. That's how he can take that next step because it's great for to have a guy that can run in between the tackles. But, when you look at this group, that's a lot of what this group is. I mean, Benjamin Hall, we saw him at times last year. I mean, at 5'11", 235 pounds, he's built like a guy that's going to be running in between the tackles. And so I would expect to see a lot of that from him again this year. I think that's what Carolina is looking to build him as, is a guy that can come in and continue to wear you down after Damon June ends up doing most of the work. Early in games could be, as you get into the middle portion of games, that's when you start seeing Benjamin Hall rotate in. Caleb Jackson, 6 foot, 234 pounds, another guy who's built very similarly and is probably going to be, focusing on running through defenders, not necessarily away from defenders. And so I think that group, you feel confident enough in that group. I hope Benjamin Hall has a better game this year. Or has a better performance this year than he did outside of one game last year. I thought, the game against Cal, he was really good. Outside of that, you didn't really get much payoff from that addition. And so you're hoping that he's going to be much better this year. The reason why I feel like there is some confidence in this room, though, is I think that Jalen McGill can be that home run guy that you're looking for. 5'10", 200 pounds, built much more like the type of guys that you're looking for to create some of those big explosive plays. And I think that's what Carolina is hoping that he can become. It's going to be, a matter of whether or not he grows up quickly because, he was a guy that last year was a part of Carolina's team. He was supposed to be in high school last year. He was a reclassed player. So this is a guy that's still very, very young. Is he going to be able to take that next step for Carolina here this offseason? Has he made a little bit of a leap? And if he has, then I think Carolina really does have a backfield that you can feel confident in. All right, you go to the wide receivers. You didn't seem too confident in this group, so I'm interested to see where this is at. Where would you grade them out at?
Yeah, I'd put them at a 5. I know what you have in Ship, and I think he's going to be a lot more productive. I think he's going to get closer to 60, 70 catch threshold, being a 1,000-yard receiver with, I would think anywhere to 6 to 8 touchdowns this upcoming year. Today, I don't know who else I think that I trust to be that consistent number 2. I think, Kobe Paysour not being back with this type of offense, I think is a bummer. I think if you would have had Paysour in this type of offense, I think he would have been set to have like a real big year. I think he'd be a perfect fit for what Bobby Petrino wants to do in the passing game. And I think this would be a room that, let's say hypothetically, right, we came back and we did this in late June, July, August, after hearing about spring practice. This could be a different grade. I could give it a much higher number. Not going to have that, though. So this will have to be one that we'll have to wait and see where it unfolds. There's talent here. There's potential here. We haven't seen it in a Carolina uniform outside of Ship. So that's why today I have to give it a 5.
Yeah, I would go just a slight bit higher. I would go with a 6. And I think the reason why is that, first of all, you got some good experience for a lot of young guys last year in this room. I think you look at guys like Shenard Clower, Madrid Tucker. We saw those guys last year get thrust into the lineup. And, I think that experience, even though it wasn't great for them last year, it wasn't great for the success of Carolina last year. I do think it's going to help Carolina out this year. And you can see those guys maybe be more effective for Carolina in the slot. Now, the question is, how much are those guys going to play? Because you've got a guy that I think is going to be one of the standouts here in the spring. You might not hear a lot coming out about Carolina, but one of the guys that I think it really has a chance to stick out is CJ Sadler. I think he might just be the best player in this class overall for Carolina out of that 2026 recruiting class. And so I think he's going to be someone that's going to prove himself pretty early to be a reliable guy that can be counted on, that Carolina can use in certain situations. And he's got a little more talent than you saw with Shenard Clower and Madrid Tucker. Those two guys were low-end 3-star recruits coming out of high school. CJ Sadler, I think, is going to provide a little bit more speed. That's something that Carolina is definitely looking for just across the board for this offense. And I think he's going to provide some make you miss ability after the catch. That's something, which was something that Carolina just did not have a year ago. So I think he's certainly going to be a big part of what Carolina does. They did go out and get Trek Kekauna at the slot position. I think that's certainly a guy that can sort of bridge the gap to a Sadler and will be serviceable enough for Carolina. And then there is something to believe in, I think, with a guy like Mason Humphrey. I know he's a guy that's coming up from the FCS level. I think there are some people that are, of course, going to question what he brings to the table, but he's a guy that's a big play threat, something that Carolina lacked last year in their offense. I mean, last year at Lehigh, he caught 35 passes for 650 yards and 4 touchdowns and averaged a career high 18.6 yards per catch. If he's able to do that again this year for Carolina, then I think you feel pretty confident about where this group is at as a whole, because you're looking for that outside deep threat that you just didn't have a year ago. And so hopefully he's a guy that I think that will be able to provide the impact that I think he will. Again, I'm not overly confident in this unit. I'm not pounding my chest about this group, but I definitely think they are worth a 6 on the confidence meter going in. All right, the tight end room, a room that was completely overhauled this offseason. Where do you stand with that group?
Yeah, I'll give it a 3. I don't know what to make of this room right now. You mentioned it was completely overhauled, and maybe that's because it needed to be. And look, you brought in, you're adding, you got guys from former big time programs like Texas with Jordan Washington, Ohio State with Jelani Thurman. So they're coming from big time programs. I think if Shamar Easter could like fill his body out, I think he could be a matchup nightmare because he is 6'5". He also had one of the worst fumbles I've ever seen a football player have in the history of the sport last year in that game against Syracuse, where at that point he should have been, in my opinion, put into the transfer portal. And I think we got to figure out with Petrino, what does he want his tight ends to do? Does he want them to be blockers, or is he going to utilize them in the passing game? And this is what makes him such an interesting, offensive coordinator, is that position has evolved during his different stops and tenures. Like when you think about when he was at Arkansas with Ryan Mallett and those guys, that was a wide receiver heavy offense where they had 3 legit wide receivers. You didn't talk about the tight end that much. And then when you got to Lamar Jackson, were their tight ends big? Were they big pass catchers? No, but they were a big part of what they did in the RPO game, being able to have an extra blocker to be able to spring a mobile quarterback like Lamar Jackson. I think this is another room that if we did this bit later on in the offseason could stand to improve and improve substantially. I think there's potential in this room. I don't know what the role is going to be in the Petrino offense, which is why today I'm so low on them as we get ready for spring practice.
Yeah, I mean, you look back at how he uses tight ends at some of his previous stops. I mean, he did like good receiving tight ends. I mean, you go back to the guys that he had at Louisville. I mean, one guy that I don't think probably gets talked about enough because of what he did for Lamar Jackson is Cole Hicatini, who was their starting tight end back then. I mean, he had 668 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns in Lamar's Heisman years. So this is definitely a guy that I think was very impactful, not only as a blocker, but certainly as a receiver. And so, yeah, I think that is an area where he is going to want somebody that can stand up and make plays as a receiver. He's also going to want someone that can put their hand in the dirt and be able to block. And I think that's why you brought in the guys that you did here. That's why you brought in Jelani Thurman, who is not really that big of a receiving threat coming out of Ohio State, but is certainly a guy that I think can help Carolina during the early portion of the season and sort of bridge that gap to some of the other guys. Jordan Washington, he's a guy that I think is going to be used to do both. I think he's certainly going to be someone that Carolina is hoping emerges as maybe more of that complete tight end than anybody else on this roster. I mean, he is 6'4", 264 pounds. So certainly a guy that's going to have the weight on him to be able to block, you would hope. And so I think one of the other guys that's worth watching here is Jackson Warren, the transfer from Colorado State as well. We saw some potential from him last year in the limited snaps that he saw in his time at Colorado State before he ends up getting banged up pretty early in the season and misses the rest of the year. He's certainly a guy that I think has a chance to be a really good player. So when I look at it, I'll go with the 6. I think this is a group that I trust a little bit more than you do for sure, just because I think that you have guys that have been at other locations. They've had success, especially a guy like Thurman. I think he's going to be far better than what Carolina had last year, and a guy like Jordan Owens, who I just really didn't think was all that great. Didn't think he was a great pickup for Carolina out of the transfer portal to begin with. And when he was the guy that was named the starter in that first game of the season, did have me cringing a little bit. I don't feel the same way with Thurman. I think he's a guy that is certainly going to be a lot better. Is he going to be perfect? No, but he's certainly going to be a lot better than what Carolina had there a year ago. And I do think Jordan Washington is an upgrade there too. Jackson Warren is that wild card. So You got him, Shamar Easter, I think, too, 6'5", 215 pounds. If you can get him to hold on to the football, then maybe you've got someone who can sort of be a matchup nightmare there. So I think there's a lot of potential in this room, and that's why I think this room is one that I have a little bit more confidence in than you do. You move to the offensive line. This one, I can't even imagine where some of these numbers are going to be. Where do you have the offensive line at?
Would it be too disrespectful to have it at a 1?
That's where I got it.
And it's just because of the uncertainty that just exists. Because you're right, outside of Christo Kelly, I don't know what this offensive line is going to look like this year. I was a big believer in Aiden Bainfeld for what he did at different times during his freshman season, but then just was nowhere to be found last year. You're bringing Andrew Threet up, but he's coming up from the FCS level. How is that going to translate? And then you look at just some other guys, you like a Jordan Hall from a UAB, who they got 6'8". You're bringing in an Eden Buchanan who was coming into a sophomore year, so he's 6'9". So I think you can see where Carolina still wants to be really, really big among the offensive line, but they were really, really big last year, and it didn't really matter. Like they had a lot of height, and I thought they had a lot of weight, and I thought they got pushed around more often than not. I never felt like they imposed their will the way that they want to, the way that they need to, the way that you're used to seeing Bill Belichick coach teams do so. So I think there's potential here. I think if they find the right 5, this could be a serviceable unit. But I don't know when they'll find that 5. And with the way they rotated guys in and out last year, if they do that same thinking again this year, it might take till the middle of the year before they find the best 5 to fit what they want to do offensively with Bobby Petrino. So I thought this was a unit that I thought after last year that we'd be able to look at this unit and say they definitely got better. And today I don't know if that's the case. They could be better. They could be what they were last year. They could be worse. And if they are what they were last year, if they're worse than they were last year, this offense won't take the step forward it needs to take. And if they don't do that, this team cannot compete for a bowl game.
Yeah, there's too many questions here to not have this at a 1. I have zero confidence in this group. Christo Kelly, you talk about him as your center. Well, that's a guy that, we should be trusting in, and maybe that's a reason that you would have it at a 2. Christo Kelly hasn't played a snap at the FBS level. So we don't even know how good he is, to be fair. He could end up being a really good player, but we don't know that for sure. And so you don't even know how good the anchor of your offensive line is going to be. Not to mention, Banfield, we got to figure out what the hell happened with him. Was he a guy that just wanted to take a redshirt year? Was he hurt? Was he a guy that fell out of favor with the coaching staff? We got to figure out what exactly went on there, because if it was just that he wanted to take the redshirt year, they thought that the guys that they brought in were better than him, then, it is what it is. I guess that's something that you could get over and feel like maybe he's going to be a better piece than the guys that were there last year. But especially if it was that he just fell out of favor with the coaching staff and was benched because they don't feel like he's a good enough player, then, that's concerning, to say the least. Andrew Threet at right tackle. I don't know how confident I can be in him, because he's having to make the jump. And, going from the FCS level to the FBS level, I know there are a lot of guys that have had success making that jump. And there'll be some guys that we'll talk about here on the defensive line and at linebacker that I feel comfortable with making that jump. Andrew Threet, based off of what I saw in terms of the Pro Football Focus numbers and doing some of the research on him, I don't feel nearly as confident. Not saying it's impossible to see him being a good player, but I don't feel nearly as confident. And then, Jordan Hall, not confident in him at all, based off of what we saw last year down the stretch of the season. Going to need to see him take a significant jump in order to get comfortable with him. And then you mentioned Aiden Buchanan. We only saw him in the first game of the season last year. That was it. After that, he was gone. He fell out of favor with the coaching staff, and he was basically gone. And so, I don't know what to necessarily believe about him either. Is he a guy that's going to be serviceable enough? And then, some of the other guys that they added in the transfer portal, Rowan Byrne, the transfer from Clemson, didn't play there. Brandon Homadi, the transfer from West Virginia, didn't play there. Shaq McRoy at Arkansas played sparingly there. Are these guys that you really trust are going to be able to make impacts? Jonah Rodriguez, the JUCO transfer. Are you expecting that he's going to come in as a JUCO and be able to make that big of an impact? So it's going to take some time. This is going to be a group that maybe coming out of spring practice, we trust a little bit more. But I still feel like there's going to be a lot of questions about this group going into the year, and it's the one I feel the most nervous about. All right, let's get to the defensive side of the ball here really quick. Get to the special teams as well, and then we'll get out of here. Defensive line, where do you sit with this group? Because they did go out, get some guys in the transfer portal to sort of reinforce this group. How confident are you in them now?
Yeah, I think this group's going to be better. Mainly because if you look at the roster, they've got about 10 to 12, 15 names listed, and I don't know how many of those guys aren't capable of contributing if they're called upon. Now, a lot of these guys are freshmen, but these were guys that were a big part of the recruiting class. Talking about Vodney Cleveland, Xavier Griffin-Hayes, Ruffin, among some other guys. But you reinforce the roster, as you mentioned, with some transfers. I think we talked about Jalen Harvey a lot back earlier this offseason. We talked about Leroy Jackson, and Isaiah Johnson being guys that need to step up and become leaders for this team. So I think I'd put it at a 6. What you got in Melcard, you got a double-digit sack guy. I think you got some proven guys, as I mentioned, with Jackson and Johnson that I think we'll take a step forward. I think if you would have had DeAndre Robinson back, CJ Mims back, I think this would probably be a 7. Those were just 2 killer late losses in the portal for Belichick and his defense. But I do like what this room. I think this room will be better next year than it is this year when these freshmen have a year in the program. They get their bodies where they need to be. But I think these freshmen are poised to, if they need to, in spot duty, give Carolina some production. So I think I'll give it a 6 with the ability to emerge to a 7 if that second pass rusher opposite Melcard Abujanra emerges sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'll go with the 6 as well. I think that Melcard is certainly a guy that you have a lot of confidence in. You feel like should be able to get similar numbers to what he got last year, as long as that second person emerges at that edge rusher spot. For me, I feel confident in that because I think that you've got Jalen Harvey, who's got the upside, who looks more like a pure pass rusher than anything. But you also got Donovan Hoylett Jr., the transfer from Richmond, who I really like. I think judging off of his numbers from last year, there is a lot to like. Again, going to have to make the jump. It wasn't great in their game against Carolina. Wasn't getting a ton of pressure on the quarterback. But you're hoping that him making that jump another year. Remember, Carolina played them early last year. So that the rest of the season, having that experience under his belt and another offseason to sort of grow here in Bill Belichick's system will ultimately help him to become an even better player than he was a year ago. Maybe not put up the same type of production, certainly at this level, but could he be a guy that can do the little things for Carolina out there opposite of Melcard Abujanra, also help them in that pass rush, maybe get, somewhere in that range that you saw Tyler Thompson get to last year at 7 sacks. If you can get somewhere in that range, then I feel like you could feel pretty confident in this group going forward. But I like Jalen Harvey a lot too. And I think that's going to be a guy that, really didn't get his opportunity at Penn State. I think now he's going to get his opportunity here, will be used as more of a pure pass rusher, probably substitute in on some of those obvious passing downs like we saw with Tyler Thompson, and could be a guy that thrives. So I really like those guys. And then when you go to the interior of the defensive line, Leroy Jackson coming back, Isaiah Johnson coming back, really important. I thought there were times last year where, CJ Mims and DeAndre Robinson had their moments where they were looking like the best players on the interior of that defensive line. But you also had moments like that from Leroy Jackson and Isaiah Johnson. Now, can they make that more consistent? I think that's going to be the big thing this year. But, you've also got guys that you really like out of the high school ranks in Bodney Cleveland, Trayshawn Ruffin, Viliami Moala. Those are guys that you feel pretty good about going into this year that hopefully will be able to provide some help there as rotational pieces. And don't forget about Xavier Lewis either. I know we only saw him, early in the season at time, playing some sparse reps here and there. But when he was on the field, and they put him on the field in important downs too, he was able to get after the quarterback. Maybe that's a guy that can rush the quarterback out of that defensive tackle position for Carolina this season. You would imagine him in the strength and conditioning, in the strength and conditioning program this year for Carolina here in the offseason probably has helped him to put on maybe a little bit more weight. They still list him at 6 foot 250, but hopefully he's had a little bit of muscle to that, and hopefully they have him in a spot that they want him coming into this year. So I feel pretty confident in this group. I think this is one of the ones that you can probably believe in a little bit more, and it's part of the reason why there's a little bit more confidence on the defensive side of the ball than there is on the offensive side of the ball. You go to the linebacker spot. What do you think about this unit? They brought in 2 big-time transfers, not big-time transfers, not, guys that are ranked amongst some of the top out of the transfer portal this year, but guys that are veterans and guys that I think could turn into pretty good players.
Yeah. The first number that popped in my head was a 4, but that number feels low. You bring in Darren McDonald from Syracuse, accomplished player. Production there was a big part of when Syracuse has been able to do the last couple of years. You bring in Peyton Seelman, but I remember the big talking point about him was what would that transition from the FCS level look like up to the FBS level. I don't think it's as big a thing at linebacker as it is at other positions. Mm-hmm. And we'll find out kind of, as long as the speed is there, because if you can tackle, you can tackle. It doesn't matter what level of football you're playing. It's really more about, is the game maybe too quick for him at this level as opposed down to that level. But it just, that feels that number feels low, just because I thought even with those times with the inconsistencies you saw from Kamori House down towards the stretch, I thought the linebacker play was adequate last year. And I thought when Carolina's defense was playing really good, the linebackers were playing really, really good. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I'll give them a 5. I'll bump them up a notch to put them right there in the middle with a chance to really improve to like a 6 or 7, if you will. Once we get into the season. I don't know why I came in as low as I did, but when I looked at it, that was the first number that popped in my head, but maybe you feel different.
Yeah, I go with the 6. I like the addition of Seelman. I think that's one of those positions where you look at the jump that guys have made from the FCS level to the FBS level. And one of the positions where I think you've seen the most type of success is at that off-ball linebacker spot. And so I feel like that's going to be him as well. I mean, you look at what he was able to do in his time at Richmond. I mean, he was incredibly productive. I think just off the top of my head here, I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but I think he had around 120 tackles a year ago for Carolina. And so I think that's exactly what Carolina's looking for. I mean, 120 tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, 9 total quarterback pressures, had 2 interceptions as well. So shows you that he's got some coverage ability, 4 pass breakups. And, I think that it was a first team all Patriot League type of guy. I think that's the type of guy that you're looking for in the portal. You're looking for diamonds in the rough. I think you potentially got one there. So I really like him. Derek McDonald as well. The big thing for him is going to be, can he stay healthy? That's the only reason why I can't really go higher on this group, because, the other thing is I really like the freshmen that are coming in too. I think DQ Forkpa, being able to move back to off-ball linebacker, at 6'1", 226, I don't see them playing him on the edge where they played him last year at St. Francis Academy. Didn't think, judging off of watching them in the national championship game that they played back in the winter, I did not think that was probably his best position either. Really liked him in some of the earlier film that I saw from him before he got to St. Francis Academy, where he was playing that off-ball linebacker spot. So I think he fits that spot really well, and really like Calvin Thomas too. I thought that was one of the biggest gets that Carolina got in this past class. Incredibly athletic. I think is going to really be able to grow into, his body as he goes throughout the spring here and then into the summer and eventually the fall. 6'3", 207. He's got to put a little bit of weight on, I think, in order to be able to, handle the physicality that he's going to see at this level. But I really like him. And then that doesn't even include guys like Tamir Hickman-Collins, Jonathan Agamadu, who started playing a little bit more towards the end of last year, and even some freshmen that I really liked from a year ago, like Tyler Hauser, who was a late addition for Carolina in Bill Belichick's initial recruiting class, and Jake Bauer, Lance Pascal. So I think there's a lot of guys in this room, depth-wise that could factor in. And then I really like the 2 guys at the top as well. Still will, hold back the confidence a little bit in this group because, again, that injury risk for a guy like McDonald, and you've got that learning curve for Sealman, but I'll still go with a 6. All right, we move on to defensive back. Again, this encompasses corners and safeties. Where do you stand with this group?
I've got it at a 6 with the ability to move up to a 7 because I do like so many different areas of the secondary outside of one Caleb Koss. I think Coleman Bryson is a guy that's going to really emerge on the back end of this defense. You talked about the corner, the corners, with Jaden Patterson. I think you feel really good about him. It's, can you find someone opposite him? I think would go a real long way. He should have played more than he played a year ago. I thought there were times that he deserved snaps over Marcus Allen, but they continue to trot Marcus Allen back out there. I think you've got a nice mixture of dudes in this back end where they've got a bunch of young talent coming into the program. So that's an area where you could see this room really grow and be developed over the years. I think they've got a nice blend of some size back there where they're a little bit longer, so that maybe they won't be picked on as much. I think they have a chance to be a lot more physical at the line of scrimmage as well, and not get beat the way that you've seen Marcus Allen, some other corners get beat. So I really like what this room can be. I think they got a little bit more athletic as well on the back end, something that they really struggled with. I think at times they just weren't really fast enough to really cover the type of ground that you need to cover in modern college football. So I'll give it a 6. I didn't even mention Greg Smith. I think he's poised to have a real nice year as well. But I'll give it a 6 with this thing to really, I think, grow and to be a 7 once we get to the start of the season.
Yeah, I'm in the complete opposite direction of you here. I got it at a 4. I'm a little bit concerned about this room. I mean, you look at the corner spot opposite of opposite of Jaden Patterson. I love Jaden Patterson. I think he's a guy that you really like, but the only spots that are locked up here for sure are Jaden Patterson starting outside corner position and Caleb Cost in the nickel. And I actually thought Caleb Cost this past year took a step forward. I thought he was better. So, who knows if they're going to leave him in there at the nickel. I think they probably should. I think that'd be the spot that you feel most comfortable with him at. But the outside cornerback spot, I just don't know who's going to emerge there. And this is why I wish we would get more out of spring practice, because, yeah, it would be nice to know who's going to be running at those at that position throughout the spring. I mentioned a D Willie earlier. Again, he's got the experience, but it's not great experience. It's not a successful track record. And so I don't really know if you trust him to be your guy there. So that means that you're looking at, other guys like Jalen Thompson, Ty Adams. Does somebody emerge from that group of holdovers, or do you trust it to a true freshman in Kenton Dobson? I think that's on the surface. You love what Kenton Dobson could bring to Carolina, and you love the fact that you would be getting a freshman out there. He would only be able to grow. But again, that's risky starting a freshman, especially if you're starting him in that first game of the season against TCU. We've seen guys do it before. Carolina did it with Patrice Rene. Remember back at the start of his career, he got torched in that game, and we didn't really hear from him for a while. Now, eventually Carolina circled back to him, but that's not, when you throw guys like that into the fire, it's not necessarily always going to result in a ton of success. So I think Carolina's got to be careful there. And then at the safety spots, there's just so much uncertainty. Is Greg Smith going to, step up and play a bigger role this year? Or is he going to continue to be in that hybrid linebacker / safety position where he's only going to see limited snaps on the field? If he can be a guy that grows into a full-time starter, then great. You feel pretty confident with what he brings to the table. And I think that's a guy that you really feel good about. If not, then you got to find two safeties back there. And look, you've got Coleman Bryson, who I think, we saw him last year. He didn't grade out well for most of the season. And I thought had some, unforgivable mistakes at times in terms of his tackling. Hopefully that's gotten better this year. I do like the potential of a guy like Javian Butts, who comes back from last year, was playing a little bit more towards the end of the season. So maybe that's a guy that, can really succeed as a redshirt freshman as opposed to what he was as a true freshman last season. You've also got, guys like Peyton Waters, who played sparingly early in the season. Maybe that's a guy that takes on a bigger role this year. And then you've also got true freshmen at that position that could potentially factor in. So there, it's a group that I think has a lot of potential, but just doesn't have the proven commodities that you can trust out there because of everything that Carolina lost from this past year back there. So I go in with it at a 4, but hopefully that's one that can grow as we get closer and closer to the season. Hopefully that's one that we hear some glowing reviews about from the limited practice time that the media will be able to observe. And maybe that will be a group that when we get our eyes on them, hopefully in a practice like a pro event or a spring game, we will really like what we see from them. All right, last group is special teams, and then we'll get out of here. Where do you have the special teams on your confidence meter?
Yeah. I was really trying to think of a number of a number here. I'll go a 7 just because I don't think Carolina's, if there's one thing I think I can trust, I think they're gonna be fine in these areas. I think they'll be able to punt the ball well. I think they'll be able to cover it. What I really wonder is, how many times are they going to have to settle for field goals, and could they maybe be, could they maybe stand to be much more productive in that department? You bring in, Aaron Burrell from LSU. You've got David Green, so you've got 2 kickers there. They got to figure out who it's going to be. But you go back to the Wake Forest game now. Brandon, part of it was because Carolina, I think, was settling for field goals as opposed to maybe being aggressive, but like their inability to make field goals cost them a chance to be in that football game late into the fourth quarter. And that was even in a game where he set the program record for longest field goal right before halftime, which was just another example of just how inconsistent this team and program was in that department. I thought their coverage units were fine. Nothing to write home about. I'd love to be a lot more explosive in the return game. Can you find someone in the punt return and the kick return game that can maybe add a different element to maybe flip field position? But I'll give it a 7 just because you know how much this is stressed. And for as much as Mack Brown failed to get it right, and he was always having to make a change at that position group, I thought Carolina, outside of some inconsistencies at time in the kicking game last year, was pretty solid all year round in their kickoff and their punt return coverages.
Yeah, I'd be so much more confident in this group if they returned one guy from last year, either their kicker or their punter. Yeah. They don't. And so you're sitting here now with David Green, probably as your guy, a kicker, even though he's a freshman, one of the more accurate freshmen in the history, or one of the more accurate kickers in the history of the state of North Carolina coming into your program. So hopefully that's a guy that carries over with. I think he's probably going to end up being the guy. But again, it's a freshman kicker. So how much do you trust that guy going into a game, especially in that first game against TCU? It's going to be hard to really have a ton of trust in him. Punter, I think there's an interesting battle that's going to be going on there. Jacob Horvath was a guy that when you got him from Eastern Illinois, you felt pretty confident that this was a guy that was going to be able to compete with Tom McGinnis. Didn't even challenge Tom McGinnis last year. And you look at some of the, when I was watching him in some of the pre-games, did not look great. So hopefully he looks a lot better than he looked last year. That means that there could be a battle for him with Aiden McCann Gibbs, who comes in out of Northern Ireland. And so hopefully he's a guy that is going to be ready. This is the first time that he's playing football. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles doing that. And so I think there are some question marks with that group. And then the return game. They went through so many guys last year, and it never felt like they settled on someone that was an explosive returner. They've got to find someone that can be explosive for them. And then, punt returner, they end up losing Will Hardy. So now they have to replace him. So I'm at a 4 with that group. I think it's a low number, but I do think that it's a group that has a chance to vastly improve as we go throughout here, because look, there are explosive guys on this roster. So there are guys that you should probably be able to slot in at some of these return spots, and they should be able to create something, but I have to see it to believe it with this group before I can give them a high vote of confidence. All right, so that does it for our look at spring practice for Carolina. Of course, any news and notes that come out around spring practice, we're going to have you covered. Same thing with the pro day. That did commence today. We have very little information. I know that is stunning to you based off of what we said earlier. We have very little information on what exactly went down. And so if we get any information, if we get any official times that were run, any of that kind of stuff, we will make sure to get that information over to you guys. That hopefully, some guys were able to help themselves a little bit today. I know Thaddeus Dixon, I don't think really did much, judging off of a tweet earlier today from a guy that covers the Carolina Panthers, does a great job of it for the Charlotte Observer, Mike Kay. It's made it seem like he did not do much during his workouts. And so we'll have to see whether or not that was the case. And if we find out any more information, we will, of course, bring that to you guys. But, make sure that you're keeping an eye on the website for any other news, any other opinion articles around the football program. We'll, of course, continue to have those for you here as we go throughout the offseason. There will be one where I will detail my favorite position battles going into camp. It'll be 5. I talked about the 2 that I really like. There will be 3 other ones that will be on there for you guys that we'll put up tomorrow morning. So make sure you're keeping an eye out for that article. The real focus right now, though, on both the website side of things and on the podcast side of things is what's going on with the basketball program, whether or not Carolina is going to move on from head coach Hubert Davis. We're going to have you covered with all of that here over the next coming days, but until there is a decision that is made. We'll be, of course, on the podcast, keeping you guys updated. Tonight, we wanted to focus a little bit on the football program as long as there wasn't anything that dropped on the basketball side of things. But, we'll be keeping you up to date with everything that's going on basketball-wise over there on the Four Corners podcast. And, of course, on the website. The minute that the news drops, we're going to try to prioritize the podcast, get on there and react immediately to whatever ends up going down. But, the website will still have you up to date on that stuff as well. So make sure that you guys are going to the website morning, afternoon, and evening for all of the latest on Tar Heel football and Tar Heel basketball. Make sure that you guys are subscribed to our YouTube page. That is the best place to be able to reach both podcasts, the video editions of the podcast, if that's the way that you like to consume us. You can also find us on the Facebook page at Heel Tough Blog, and also the same thing on the Twitter pages at Heel Tough Blog. We make sure to share any additions of the podcast to that page. If you want to get the raw link to the Twitter the Twitter iteration of the podcast, you can go to at @HTB_Josh. That is Josh's personal page. You can also follow me on Twitter at HTB Anthony. So make sure that you guys are doing all of that for us. We would greatly appreciate it. That wraps up this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Josh for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.